the question whether it is fundamentally good that we should be here, that human beings should be an end unto themselves, whether or not.
Or have any value at all, or
absolutely.
just a destructive force.
Right.
You know, you hear people say all the time things like, "Oh, people are just a cancer on the planet." It's like, do you know who's speaking through you when you say that? You think that's funny? You think that's cute?
Right.
You think that's moral? That's a genocidal impulse that you're allowing to give voice through you. There's nothing about that that's acceptable. And we're going to see in the winter catastrophe in Europe.
Absolutely.
Because of this moral pretense that human beings are like Malthusian yeast in a petri dish,
Exactly.
justified by the science. It's like that's your biological model, is it? That the children of the poor are just yeast in a petri dish.
Absolutely.
It's like, okay,
Right.
I know who's animating your soul.
Who is animating your soul?
That's what we're going to find out.
Well, I mean, we were discussing earlier this notion that the man
It's not the logos.
It's surely not. I mean, the idea of man as microcosm, that in some sense, the final capstone. I mean, what does God invite Adam to do at the end of creation? To give names to the animals. And we were talking in front of the theater of Dionysus about the imposition, right, of language,
Yeah.
the order-making function.
To subdue the world.
Right, right.
And that means to put everything in its proper place.
Yes,
And
and-
right, to give everything its due.
Right. And
To
not
organize it.
urgently to exploit it or to,
Right?
you know.
Tend it.
And so, yeah, to me, the fundamental error, the conceit that there's such a thing as the good of the earth without the good of humanity, that humanity can somehow detract from the good of the earth, when in fact, we really do create the good of the earth in some ways, or at least we finalize it.
Or at least we participate in it.
Surely, right. At the very least, it can't make sense without us in some ways.
We're either outside the natural order, or we're not. If we're outside the natural order, then what are we? From the environmental perspective, what exactly are we? And if we're inside the natural order, then we're not interlopers.
Yeah, yeah. Is that scene in The Matrix where Agent Smith says to Neo, I took a long time in this, hellish virtual reality trying to figure out what people are, and then I realized, you're not mammals, you're a disease, you're a virus. I mean, you talk about...
Yeah, well, that's the language.
Right, who's speaking through you, and even just casually in this COVID madness, a pandemic of the unvaccinated. I mean, the way that we learned to talk about our fellow man reflects this as well. When you called it an apocalyptic conflict, I wonder if you can say more what that word means.
Well, I
when you
think
use
what
it.
we're seeing, in some sense, around us, is an acceleration of the battle between the spirit of Abel and the spirit of Cain. And I think the reason that that's the first biblical narrative in history, because the narrative of Adam and Eve is outside of history in some real sense, is because a war has raged since the beginning of time, conscious time, human time, let's say, between the spirit of appropriate sacrifice, aimed at establishing the highest good, and the spirit of deceit, resentment, and envy. And then that manifests itself in various forms politically, but that's the fundamental story of the hostile brothers. And the hostile brothers are the two first children, the two children of the original couple. And so they're emblematic of two patterns of existence, two antithetical patterns of existence. And Cain is bitter because his sacrifices are of second-rate quality, and he knows that, but he's bitter because they're rejected by God, which basically means he's bitter because he can't pull the wool over the eyes of God. I'm taking 4 of my esteemed colleagues and you across the world. Oh, wow, this is amazing. To rediscover the ways our ancient ancestors developed the ideas that shaped modern society.
It was a monument to civic greatness.
To visit the places where history was made.
That is ash from the actual fires when the Babylonians burned Jerusalem from 2,500 years ago.
To walk the same roads.
We are following the path of the crucifixion.
And experience the same wonder.
We are on the site of a miracle.
What kind of resources can human beings bring to a mysterious but knowable universe?
Science, art, politics, all that makes life wonderful.
And something new about the world is revealed.
And then he has the unmitigated gall to call God to account for the lack in his creation.
That it's somehow the fault of the objective standards that he fails to live up to.
The fault of reality itself.
Right, which is a very, very recognizable, I think, moral gesture now.
Yeah, well, it's the ultimate sin of pride. It's like, I have the right to call God out on his lack of virtue.
Right.
It's like, do you now?
Yeah.
Now, I've been trying to give that argument its due, because you can understand why people who are suffering. First of all, sometimes people suffer because it does appear that their sacrifices go unheeded. There are times when people are subject to what appear to be arbitrary catastrophes,
Sure enough.
despite their best efforts, let's say. Although the degree to which catastrophes occur despite our best efforts is indeterminate.
Right.
Because we also all know that most of the time we could have done a little better.
Sure.
To say the least. And very often we're not bringing our A game to the table.
That's right.
So now you might say, well, being itself, this is the Mephistophelian perspective, and it's outlined in Goethe. Mephistopheles makes the claim that existence itself is so corrupt because of the suffering it produces that it would be better if it just came to an end. And Ivan in The Brothers Karamazov basically makes that argument in some real sense to Alyosha, although he says, I can't believe in God because of the suffering of children. And it's possible that the reason that a given person fails to abide by the divine is because they care so much about suffering children. But I'm a little skeptical about that claim generally.
Sure.
It's like, I see, so the reason that you've dispensed with the transcendent is because you're too moral. Really? It's like, okay.
Yeah.
Now, you can outline a rational argument that a world where the innocent suffer is untenable. But I've been thinking about that more recently too. I do believe that the core problem that has to be addressed in some sense in life is the reality of suffering, which is why we talk today about the fact that the tragic play has to be at the center, because we have to contend with the tragic play. But I've been thinking more about the sin in the Garden of Eden after a man named Matthew Pajot outlined to me, I think, a very convincing case for what that sin was. His idea was something like the sin of Eve was hearkening too narcissistically to the voice of the serpent. That Eve stands for what's outside the imposed cognitive order, and she gives voice to the marginalized because she gives voice to the distress of the infant. And if the categorical order isn't fulfilling the requirements of the innocent, then it's insufficient. And it's up to Eve to bring that suffering to the attention of Adam, who does the naming. But Eve's sin might be to believe that her compassion is so overweening that everything, even that which is poisonous, can now be brought within the confines of the garden. I'm so compassionate that everyone falls under my care now. And Adam's sin is that he wants to impress Eve, and so says that can be managed. And so in some real sense, they both bite off more than they could chew. It's a consequence, and the consequence is the fall. And then you think, well, in your own life, do you suffer because suffering is intrinsic to being, or do you suffer because you bite off more than you can chew? And that's a really good question, because if you're progressing optimally, and so that would be progressing in the spirit of play, then you can exist in a mode that's very, very positive. And so then you might ask, if you were perfect at that, which of course is an unattainable goal, but if you were perfect at that, would you be able to exist in a play with life? And would that eradicate most suffering? And then you might ask, well, would that eradicate all suffering? Because you could even ask, well, if we all played optimally, like every single person, right? So we all revealed that which was hidden within us in that spirit of play, how good would the world be? And that's also an open question, because you know it would be a lot better than it is.
Right.
And then, well, what's the upper limit?